10. After the Sabbath, as the first light of the new week dawned, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to vigil at the tomb. Suddenly the earth reeled and rocked under their feet, as God's angel came down from heaven, came right up to where they were standing. He rolled back the stone, and they sat on it. Shafts of lightning blazed from him. His garments shimmered snow white. The guards at the tomb were scared to death. They were so frightened they couldn't move. The angels spoke to the women. There is nothing to fear here. I know you're looking for Jesus, the one they nailed to the cross. He is not here. He was raised just as he said. Come and look at the place where he was placed. Now get on your way quickly and tell his disciple he is risen from the dead. He is going on ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. That's the message. The women, deep in wonder and full of joy, lost no time in leaving the tomb. They ran to tell the disciples. Then Jesus met them, stopping them in their tracks. Good morning, he said. They fell to their knees, embraced his feet, and worshipped him. Jesus said, You're holding on to me for dear life. Don't be frightened. Like that, go tell my brothers that they are to go to Galilee, and I will meet them there.
Very good. Let's give Trent a round of applause. That's a great scripture reading. Okay, so here's the challenge for you. This is Trent. Week by week, I'm going to introduce you to a new high school person. In the same way that the women were terrified when they met Jesus, I know that a lot of you get terrified when you see a high school kid. They're human beings. When you see a kid out there in this church with a yellow shirt, it is your job, not their job, your job to stick your hand out and say, Hi, I'm so-and-so, and who are you? And you're going to do this every single Sunday until you know every kid in our church by name. Got it? Good. All right. Here's something that is a non-option. Mitch, I might need a little music on this. You got that 3x5 card? Get that 3x5 card, get that pencil. Because I want you to think about someone, if you don't have a 3x5 card, once again, if you don't have a 3x5 card, raise your hand. There's a couple people up here who didn't hear, they were playing music. This is a serious time. I'm switching to something serious. I want you to think about somebody in your world that's devastated. Someone in your world who's going through a really, really hard time. This might be you. Might be someone that you love and care about. Might be your spouse, your partner. It might be your child, your grandchild. It might be your sibling. It might be a stranger to you, but someone that you know in your workplace. And if you don't know of somebody, then I'm telling you that you are not living big enough. If you're sitting here today and you do not know somebody who is going through a tough time, then right after this church service, you're gonna go talk to Barb Rudolph, and you're gonna sign up, or Marie Schreiber, and you're gonna sign up to be on our church prayer list. Because there's a lot of devastated people just in our own congregation. And I want you to take a minute right now, and I want you to write down this person's situation. If it is your situation, don't be frightened. Write that down. Just take a moment right now and give some clarity around it. This is not an option. Everybody's got to do this. It's okay to talk about yourself on this. Put some detail around it. A person has lost their job. The person has just been diagnosed with leukemia. This person is very lonely. I'm really worried about my grandson because he's going through this tough time, but he's lost his way in life. He's battling alcoholism. This person is devastated because they have lost a sense of meaning, a sense of hope, a sense of purpose. I'm concerned about this person because they seem to be drowning in debt. And again, this person might be you. I want you, as you're writing, I want to talk about this sermon title is called The Cul-de-sac of the Soul. And the reason why I want to call it cul-de-sac, how many of you live on a cul-de-sac? Raise your hand. Raise your hand, cul-de-sac. Do you know what cul-de-sac means? Cul-de-sac is a French word that means the bottom of the bag. Really, that's what it means, the rear end of the bag, and there's actually a different word that I can't say because I'm in church, what usually doesn't stop me, but I'm trying to raise my sensibilities. This person, hopefully, on your card represents someone who's at a cul-de-sac. I call it a spiritual cul-de-sac, the bottom of the bag. And you are here today. God brought you here today. I don't believe that it's an accident that you decided to get out of bed today to come to church, because there's something inside of you that said, I got to go today. I need to go today. Well, I believe that the reason why you're here today is because of this card. And by the end of the service, you're going to understand why God brought you here today and why you have a particular card in your hand. Because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the resurrection and what the resurrection means. Because we're continuing our sermon series on Jesus is greater than Christianity. And if you've been with us since September, you have seen us go through some amazing sermons as we've been talking about how the first century gave rise to the books in the New Testament. And I know that this has been a challenging sermon series for so many people. In fact, every single Sunday, people have been telling me, you're going too fast, you're going too fast. And I know that this is brand new material for a lot of people. It's been very exciting for me. I have been loving this sermon series because it's given me the opportunity to talk with you about some of the things that are vitally important in my life and in my faith. So if nothing else, it's been really good for me. If this has been going too fast for you, that's why God invented YouTube. Because you can go on YouTube and you can watch every single sermon and you can pause it and you can repeat it over and over until you get this. Because today I need to go fast because I need to try to get you out on time. I didn't do so good at the first service. Because today there's a lot of material that I got to pack in today. And so if I go too fast for you, tough. That's why God invented YouTube, and you can go home tonight and you can watch it. You pay attention to it. I'll blog it. I'll Twitter about this coming week. Because today what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to end up with Matthew and Luke, and we're going to talk about the resurrection story as it comes to us from Matthew and Luke. But to do all this, I got to kind of go back to where we were 3 weeks ago, where I set up that human timeline, and I talked about the guy that is right here that we call Jesus of Nazareth. I don't want you to think about him as Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ. That's later. He, right now, is called Jesus of Nazareth. As I said way back in September, he is the illiterate peasant theological savant. One of the things that I constantly have to tell people is that he really was just a human being. He was illiterate, he was a peasant, he was a theological savant. Couldn't read, he couldn't write, but yet he was awake to the presence of God in such a way that he tried to wake other people to the presence of God. One of the things that I have to remind people when I go to different places and I speak to different people, I tell people that this illiterate peasant theological savant believed that the world was flat. Squeaks, I like that, squeak. He believed the world was flat. In fact, actually, every single person in the Bible believed that the world was flat. In fact, we didn't believe that the world was round until I think it was, 1500, something like that. I'll never forget one time I was working with a group of grad students around this, and I said, grad students, I love this, and I said, Jesus believed the world was flat, and this one person was adamant, he did not. I said, he didn't? No. Why? Well, why? Well, because he was Jesus. And, well, he knew everything. And he would have told us, he just knew it. And I said, well, don't you think he would have told us something earth-breaking? Did he know quantum mechanics? Euclidean geometry? I can't even believe I can say that word. No. He believed that the world was flat. We're talking about an ancient civilization. When you read the Bible, you are not reading people who live in a world that is similar to your world. It's a fundamental framework that you got to think about. Even though they're human beings like us with some of the same things, they were radically, fundamentally different. And yet, in the midst of his difference, he was brilliant, as he was open to and hooked into the presence of God, and he tried to awaken people up to the presence of God. And what made him so brilliant is that he, as a part of his culture, was aware of the fact that the Jewish temple had it wrong. The Jewish temple said that for you to be clean, for you to not live in a state of sin, that you needed to go to the temple and to sacrifice. And it depended upon your economic ability and the sin that you committed, you had to go constantly and buy and offer a cereal offering, a grain offering, a dove offering. You had to buy a lamb, a lamb all the way up to a bull, and those bulls were hugely expensive. And when Jesus, this illiterate peasant, theological savant, he looked at this system that people were caught in, and he said, no, there's no way, this is wrong. This is wrong. And he told the people, you don't have to do this. In fact, when he stood outside the temple and he watched the money changers and how the people were being swindled, he went down and flipped over the table. He said, this is wrong. Well, you can imagine what happened when the people of the temple who had their cash flow interrupted. They weren't exactly pleased, were they? In fact, if somebody came to this church and told you did not have to give to Columbine United Church, you know what I would do to them? Crucify them. I would crucify him, and that's exactly what they did. They took him and they put him on a cross and they killed him. They executed him. And they put him in the tomb. And they thought that he was dead, problem taken care of. This is where the story of the illiterate peasant theological savant gets very, very interesting. Is everybody paying attention to me right now? Because if you miss this next point, you miss almost the whole thing that I'm going to try to say, that I've been trying to say since September, I'm going to try to say going forward. Then something happened. I call it the great, grand, glorious something that happened. Now, when we think about this great, grand, glorious something that happened, we think about it like from Easter Sunday, where we sing, Christ the Lord is risen today, and all this great song and music, and we lift high the cross with flowers, and we cry because it's so inspirational, and we read the Easter stories, and it's, Easter. And I want you to forget about all that, because that's not helpful. It will be helpful in 2 weeks when we actually get it Easter Sunday, not today. Because what happens is that gives us the framework by which we look back at the great, grand, glorious something that happened. And you shouldn't do that yet. Because it was something that happened that nobody has ever agreed with. Nobody has ever come to a common understanding of what it is that happened. And what I think one of the great crimes of Christianity is that they've tried to force you into thinking that they know what happened, and you have to agree with them about what it is that happened on that day. We don't know what happened on that day. What we do know is that God acted in a fundamental way in this man's life, this illiterate peasant theological savant, that blew open the world. And everybody's been trying to figure it out since. And what we're going to see, the whole New Testament, is different people's account of what they think happened on that great, grand, glorious something that happened. But it's different. It's different accounts. And the glorious thing about this, and this is why Jesus is greater than Christianity, the whole sermon series is called this, is because the opportunity, the challenge, the gift is for you to decide for yourself about what you believe this great, grand, glorious something is that happened and what the effect is that it's going to have on your life. Now, as history moves on, I got to go quickly through this. We've talked about the fact that after Jesus, there was this thing that was called the Q source, and the Q source are all the stories that were written about Jesus, that after the great, grand, glorious is something that happened to all the disciples, and I know I'm talking fast because I got a lot to cover. all the disciples got together. They started telling the stories about the life of Jesus, the parables, the lessons, the prayers, et cetera, et cetera. And scholars have been able to put together what this is. And you can actually go online, go to Amazon and buy a book called The Q Source, where it's all written down like that. What's fascinating is that the Q Source did not have any story of the crucifixion or the resurrection. That's absent. That's key for later on, all right? Then, about 35 to about 40, the Apostle Paul has an account, talked about this last week, with the resurrected Jesus. And here's the key thing to understand. Paul talks about the fact that it is the resurrected Jesus. One quick commentary about this, how art shapes our mindset. Mass Brill gave me this insight. If you look here on the left-hand side, there is a book that the Apostle Paul is writing with a binding and a cover. We didn't Gutenberg develop that thing called the printing press. See, this is how we project so many things, and we think their world is like ours. No. Apostle Paul, in all his brilliance, thought the world was flat. Anyways, the Apostle Paul was the first person who started thinking. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says that he had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Now, when we hear the word resurrected Jesus, immediately we flash on it. We know what that means. That he had some type of physical encounter with the resurrected Jesus that was acts. It's not Paul. Paul, in his own writing, talks about the fact that he had a spiritual encounter with the resurrected Jesus. He was the first person who stood here in history about 15 to 20 years after the Great Grand Glorious, the GGHS, something that happened, and asked himself the question, what does it mean? And if you heard me preach last Sunday, what we talked about is that Paul talked about that it was a spiritual encounter. And he used the example of a seed that goes down into the ground. It's planted. And because it's planted and died, there's a transformation and something else happens. And he said, Jesus' body went into the ground. He said, people ask me, what does a resurrected body look like? And he says, no, what a silly question that is. The body is planted, transformed, the soul is released. It's important to understand that Paul, as a Pharisee, was the one who introduced the concept of resurrection to the people of the way, because the Pharisees were the first one in the Jewish Hebrew tradition who had the notion of resurrection from the intertestamental time period. It's when the Pharisees kind of emerged in the intertestamental time period. They got their notion from either the Babylonians or the Egyptians, who believed in that there was an afterlife, that this life that we're living is not the final answer. And so they brought that into the Jewish Hebrew tradition. So when Paul stands here and looks back at Jesus and asks himself, what does this grand glory, something that happened? Paul went, resurrection. Resurrection. And he was the first one who was able to articulate that because of the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, that God acted fundamentally in his life that broke the chains of death. The power of God broke the chains of death, went this way, and now the power of God is working now in the midst of our life. The first theologian, if you will, of the early church. And after Easter, we're going to start looking at Paul's letters to actually kind of get into some of the midst of Paul's thinking. History progresses on. And in about 70 A.D., 70 to 75 of the Roman persecution, the destruction of the temple. I'm coming down here on the timeline because this is where we had Mark. Mark was the first one who actually started putting together the stories of the life of Jesus because these first generation followers of Jesus began to die off. And there was a sense that we need to capture these stories. So he was the first one who sat down to write these stories, and he had that Q source that we talked about. And there was on the first Sunday of Lent, when we started this sermon series, Justin preached one of the most brilliant sermons I've ever heard, where he explained this process and how it happened. Also, it's why God invented YouTube, so you could go back and watch that sermon. The interesting thing is that the Q source that he used has no account of the crucifixion in it. Where did Paul get his material to write about the crucifixion? Christians disagree. A lot of Christians believe that God divinely inspired the author. That's all right. A lot of people believe that. I don't believe that. You can have to decide for yourself. What I believe is that we know that Jesus was crucified via Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, who in a footnote in his great history talks about Jesus who was crucified. But we don't have an account. Where did the account come from? Well, what we do know is that Paul's community was being crucified day in and day out. What we do know is that when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they were crucifying up to 500 Jews and Christians a day. All he had to do was to look around. He could see what the Romans were doing. It was very easy for him as he wrote the story, to say, this is how Jesus was crucified. And he wrote it in such a way so that his people who were being crucified went, man, what we're going through is exactly what Jesus went through. And there is a sense of identification. See, that's for me is how I believe God works. God inspires us in the midst of our context. That's Mark. History progresses. And we need to move on down here to the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Now, what's really interesting is that Matthew and Luke have two very different historical contexts than Mark does. Matthew is writing when the persecution has begun to ease down. Matthew is writing to a group of very wealthy Jewish Christian converts. And what he's trying to do is to educate them in the ways of Jesus. He's trying to convince those who are thinking about converting to the way of Jesus. He's trying to convince them that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, the long-appointed Messiah. And everything in his gospel is going to try to bring you to the point where at the end of the gospel, you put the book down and you say, by gosh, he was the Messiah. And what Matthew has in front of him is he has Mark's gospel and he has Q and he has his own material. And he actually takes all of Mark and he puts it into his gospel, and he is also then informed by the Q source. And the interesting thing about Matthew is that he gives us the first account of the resurrection. He gives us the first account of the resurrection. I'm going to kind of scoot down just a little bit more into history. This is somewhere around 80 to 85, around in there, that we think Matthew and then Luke wrote. Luke had Mark, he had Q, he had his own material. And he gave us also an account of the Easter story. The first written accounts that we know of. Now, my mother, who watches all my sermons, bless her heart, she's got to get a life. She knows that God gave her YouTube, and she watches it. And she sent me an email. She says, surely there were other people who were writing about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, that we've been lost to history. I wrote back, Mother, you're brilliant. Of course there were. There were many Gospels. In fact, I really contend that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John wrote more than just these one Gospels because they're brilliant. As someone who dabbles with writing, I know that you just don't sit down and the first time you pick up a pen and write, you write something beautiful as these Gospels. No, they were accomplished. They had to have written other treatises. They had to have written other Gospels that had been lost to us by history, which is a crying shame. And when we get to heaven, I'm hoping I get to go into the heavenly library and read everything else they wrote. So we know that there were other pamphlets, other Gospels, other things we're writing, but history is only preserved for us these. And as far as we know, these are the first accounts of the resurrection. Where did they get their material? Some say God put their hand upon them and inspired them. Could be. I think it was more a portion of their context. And what's fascinating is we think that they tell this same story. They don't. They tell radically different stories about what happened on that great, grand, glorious something that happened. Let's look, first of all, oops, I missed a slide, on the similarities between the two Gospels. The similarities between the two Gospels of Matthew and Luke. There's an empty tomb. All right, they go and they see an empty tomb. That's the first similarity. There's women who go to the empty tomb. Both Matthew and Luke have women that go to an empty tomb. The stone is rolled away. Stone is rolled away. Jesus physically appears. Those are the commonalities. The differences are night and day. Night and day. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly tell you the stories and show you how different they are night and day. First of all, there is the Gospel according to Matthew, which our brilliant liturgist read for us this morning. Trent, right? Yes. Brilliant liturgist read for us this morning. And the story is basically this. This time the women go to the tomb, and they see that the tomb has been rolled away. The stone has been rolled away because an angel has descended from heaven. In Mark's gospel, Mark's account, that brings us only up to the empty tomb, there are two men that are sitting there. Two men that are sitting there. The women come to the empty tomb. The men say to, it's either one or two men, I wish I could remember that. He is not here. He's gone to Galilee. Go ahead, go to Galilee, and he's going to meet you there. And Mark ends it by saying that the women leave, and they are terrified. And that's how the gospel ends. That's how the gospel ends. So disconcerted, actually, were church historians, in the centuries after, because the New Testament wasn't completely canonized until about like the 1300s, around in there. Long process of canonization. That there were several scribes afterwards that became so anxious about Mark's ending that they wrote two separate endings, because we can't have the gospel ending with women being terrified, because that doesn't really make for a good Easter Sunday. Well, so Matthew ends it that the angels come, they roll down the stone, and roll away the stone, and they say, don't be terrified. And what's really interesting is because what is powerful about Matthew's gospel is that at the moment of crucifixion, when Jesus is crucified, Matthew quickly cuts to the temple of Jerusalem. And he says the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom, that there was this huge earthquake. And the veil of the temple was torn to top to bottom. The significance of it is that this veil held the Holy of Holies, that only the high priest could go into, because the Holy of Holies is the seat where God himself sat. And when the veil of the temple is torn from top to bottom, what Matthew is saying is God became so angry at Jesus' crucifixion that God walked out of the temple. And if you're a Jew, because remember Matthew's gospel is a polemic against Judaism, you would have been like, what? God's no longer in the temple? You got to be kidding me. And part of what Matthew is saying in the resurrection is that's right. God is no longer in the temple because God is in the middle of our midst. And so the angels who descend, roll away the stone. The women come. Don't be terrified. Go find Jesus. He's going before you to Galilee. And so they're going before Jesus to Galilee. And suddenly, Jesus physically appears. And the women are stunned, and they drop on their knees, and they grab a hold of him. And Jesus says, you're holding on to me like you're terrified. Don't be terrified. Isn't this interesting? Matthew has Mark in front of him. How does Mark end his gospel? The women are, "Blah!" Matthew has Jesus say to the women, don't be terrified. Don't be terrified. Go tell the disciples I'm going ahead, I'm going to meet you in Galilee. Matthew then cuts very quickly to this crazy scene where the Roman guards who were supposed to be guarding the stone in front of the tomb, they go back to the Jewish leaders, and the Jewish leaders are going, oh my gosh, we can't let this story get out. Here's some money. You say from here on out that they came and they stole the body. And they say, and Matthew says, and from this day forward, that's the story that's been told. And then Matthew cuts quickly then yet again to a huge mountain where Jesus is gathered together with the disciples, and he gives them the Great Commission. Go out into the world, make disciples of all the nation, and listen to this, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The first words of the Trinity that were ever spoken in the New Testament. I guarantee you that guy did not say that. That was not a concept that guy had. It was a concept that this guy had, Matthew, as the early church was beginning to form. And they were actually beginning to baptize people in Jesus' name. That's a product of the early church. Matthew's gospel ends by Jesus actually blasting off into heaven. We call it the ascension, end of the gospel. That's Matthew. Luke. Let's go to Luke real quickly. Luke, an amazing story, The women come to the tomb. The stone is rolled away. There is the angels that tell them, I can't remember if it's an angel or a man. I thought I had these stories memorized. Go tell the disciples that he is not here. The women run back. They tell the disciples, you won't believe this the tomb is empty. He's not there. The disciples, a bunch of guys, say, you're telling us idle tales. You're lying to us. Don't lie to us. Peter, however, is curious. He goes back to the tomb. He looks inside the tomb. It's empty. And he goes back home. What a guy. Again, what a guy. I mean, how dumb can you be? How miraculous is this? Something fundamental has happened. And instead of being curious and asking myself the question, what has happened? What is going on? He just decides to go back and have brunch? I don't get that. And then Luke tells us this incredible story that we call on the road to Emmaus. That two disciples get up and they go walking on the road to Emmaus. And as they're going on the road to Emmaus, that suddenly Jesus appears to them. The interesting thing, the two guys do not know that it is Jesus who appears to them, which is kind of funny and odd, but it's a great thing that Luke adds to the story. And as they're going, they're bummed out, and Jesus says to the two guys, even though they don't know he's Jesus, they say, why are you so bummed out? And the two guys say back to Jesus, what, are you the only person in Jerusalem who does not know what has just happened? The person that we followed who was Jesus, who was crucified, and some women, members of our group, they went to the tomb and found the tomb was empty, and we don't know what to believe anymore. And then Jesus says, are you kidding? Are you nuts? Don't you know? And then he unlocks the scriptures, beginning with the Torah, moving through the wisdom literatures and the prophets, and brings them up all the way to this moment to show them exactly why all these things had to happen and why this person that they're following is indeed the chosen one of God. And by this time, it's dinner time. They go inside their house. They sit down. They have dinner. And when they break bread, they go, it's Jesus! And they realize it's Jesus, and then suddenly, poof, Jesus disappears. Seriously, that's poof, he's just gone. And they say, did not our hearts burn within us? Did not our hearts burn within us? And they go back and they tell the other disciples, we just saw Jesus, we had dinner with him. And all of a sudden, poof, Jesus reappears. But it's a physical reappearance. It's not a ghost, it's a physical reappearance. And he says, here, I'll prove it to you. Give me some fish. And they give him some fish, and he eats it. And the gospel continues on, but I'm going to end the story there. Now, 3 different accounts. 3 marvelously, radically different accounts. And the more that we try to harmonize these stories and make them say the same things. And there's many, many Christians, and I'm going to be bombarded with emails this week from people I don't know who are going to say, you are teaching heresy. You are leading your congregation to hell. Because they want us to believe that these are really the same story. They're telling the same story, and we just don't know. We don't have God's wisdom. Oh, heavens, stop it. The beauty is that they tell different stories. Because here's the insight. We don't take the Bible literally. I don't teach you to take the Bible literally. I teach you to take the Bible seriously. Because when you take the Bible seriously, suddenly it becomes metaphoric. Because when we allow the people to be people that are different than us and living in a flat world, that there's not a one-to-one correlation between their lives and ours. So we allow them to speak metaphorically. And here's for me the keys. Does not God work differently in different lives? Do not you have a different story about how God has worked in your life than the person you're sitting beside? And is not that the richness of the Christian faith? Is that not the richness of the gospel? Is that not the richness? And to make it all feel as though we have to say and believe the same thing is living small. And there's one thing I want to encourage you to do is live large in the faith. And the beauty of these 3 gospels is it allows you to say, I believe differently. The most important 2 words in the entire New Testament are the words according to, the gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and next Sunday, John. God works differently in different lives, and this gives you tacit approval to decide for yourself who God is according to you. What the resurrection is according to you. Now, having said that, there are a few key things we must understand to give Matthew and Luke their integrity. For them, the resurrection was a physical thing. Jesus appeared bodily and physically to them. And we cannot underestimate that. And they believed that. They taught their followers to believe that. And the vast, vast number of Christians, a lot of Christians believe that Jesus bodily rose. And that is good, and that is okay. And you're sitting out there, and some of you actually believe that, and that is good, and that is okay, because it gives us hope. For a lot of people, it fuels their faith. And if that is you, I want to say, God bless you, and amen. Because then it's something real and something physical for you to hang on to, and that's what Matthew and Luke wanted you to know. That the Christian faith is something real and physical. That God did something unique and powerful in the life of Jesus, and they wanted you to seriously to hang on to that. However, there are other people who don't believe that. And there are people who have sidled up to me over the years, and they come and they set appointments, or they've kind of pulled me off to the side in the narthex, and they said, but Steve, I really don't believe that he bodily rose. Am I not a Christian? I say, no, of course not. Of course you are. Because a lot of people ask me, I said, well, you're not really a Christian, are you? I say, well, either I'm the best kind of Christian or I'm the worst kind of Christian. Because I give permission to people to think differently and to think openly. And you might not like that. So I might be the worst kind of Christian for you. But I think I'm the best kind of Christian. See, there's a lot of people who have come to me and have asked me over the years, what if they dug down, they actually found the tomb where they know that Jesus was buried? They could do some kind of DNA, and they say, yep, this is him. What does that do? And I've said, nothing. What do you mean nothing? Well, doesn't that just disprove the resurrection? No. It might if you believe in a bodily resurrection, but for me, I'm more akin to the Apostle Paul. And what it really says is that Paul is right. If we found the body of Jesus, we basically said, Paul is right. The body goes down into the ground and dies, and the spirit is released and is transformed. Do you see that motion? Just because there's a body doesn't mean that it's not true. Now, having said all that, I do believe in the bodily resurrection. But now watch me, because I'm the David Copperfield of theology. I'm going to do a sleight of hand here, because I do not take Matthew and Luke literally. I take them metaphorically. And because I take them metaphorically, I can say with all my heart, yes, the resurrection of Jesus is something bodily. But the difference is our bodies, our lives. I want you to go to your card. Look at your card. Look at your card. Read this card. This is someone who has been crucified. Crucifixion is real. We crucify people day in and day out. Do you know that I read this past week that in Saudi Arabia, people who were caught, young men who were caught in their teens stealing, were beheaded. And some places in Saudi Arabia, they actually crucify people. Still. I thought we learned the world was round. And yet, metaphorically, in our society, there's people who live crucifixion. There's a lot of pain. And you might be the one who feels like there's a spike that is driven into your hands and into your feet day in and day out. Or you might know somebody who does that to themselves. Their heart is that way. And that's why the story of the crucifixions, I believe, are inspired. Because while they spoke in a particular time, they are timeless. Well, I believe that what the four Gospels are trying to say is that the power of the resurrection breaks into the cul-de-sacs of the soul and tells each and every one of us that this is not God's final answer for life. The challenge is, though, is that in the midst of our lives and our world, God is counting upon you to act. There's only one way these people are going to experience the resurrection, is that if you bring them the resurrection. So look at this card. Look at your card. Look, don't look at me. I want you to hand it behind you. Hand it behind you. If you're in the back, you got to hand it forward. Don't be silly. Look at the card. Read it. This is someone who is in need of the resurrection. Hand the card behind you. Hand it to your side. Read the card. Read the card. If you end up with your own card, you're not doing it right. You're supposed to have somebody else's card. Read the card. This is somebody who needs the resurrection. Let's do it one more time so everybody's cards are really screwed up. This is somebody who needs the resurrection. This is someone who's in the midst of a cul-de-sac of the soul. God does not want this person in this place of their life. So what you are going to do this week is you're going to keep this card with you. And you're going to put it in your shirt pocket. You're going to put it on your refrigerator. You're going to put it on your dashboard. And all week long, you're going to pray for a miracle. You're going to pray for God to raise up people. You're going to pray for God to give this person insights. You're going to pray for God to tell this person that they are not alone. And this is then going to wake you up to the crucifixions around you. And then it's going to wake you up to your need to be the resurrection, because Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The life. That means this life. And it is your calling. You are here to bring life. That is what he said 2,000 years ago. And that is what we believe. Let us pray. Living God, it's an amazing story. And even though it's a part of history, it's timeless. There's so much pain in this world, oh God. There is so much pain. And it is your desire that people break out of this pain and find a new day. Find the resurrection. And so I ask, oh God, that you give us the ability to be the living example of your light and your love and your life. Give us the ability to shine, to let our light shine, so that you might be a living presence in the midst of people's lives. May the crucifixion stop. May the beheading stop. May the killing stop. May we be the ones who stop it, and instead bring the word of hope and love, the message of your Son, Jesus, who taught us to pray, and we will say the prayer today. Our Father,